20 Vietnamese soldiers held off 2,800 Chinese attackers on Hill 1050, dealing 422 casualties in 3 days, while losing only 2 men. This is the costliest military paradox China's punitive expedition would reveal. 26,000 dead in just 28 days. Why did overwhelming numbers turn into disaster? And what did Beijing risk to prove a point? The answer begins with a broken alliance and a fateful dawn. In the decades after World War II, China and Vietnam shared a bond built on blood and ideology. Mao Zedong called the relationship as close as lips and teeth. Chinese advisors and weapons were critical in Vietnam's victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and again during the long struggle against the United States. By the late 1970s, the alliance was unraveling. Tensions flared as Vietnam moved closer to the Soviet Union. In November 1978, Hanoi signed a mutual defense treaty for 25 years with Moscow, a pact that Beijing saw as a direct threat. The old friendship had become a triangle of suspicion, with China now fearing Soviet encirclement on its southern border. Events in Cambodia tipped the balance from suspicion to crisis. On December 25, 1978, Vietnamese forces launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia, toppling the Khmer Rouge regime in less than 2 weeks. Phnom Penh fell on January 7, 1979. For Beijing, this was more than a regional dispute. The Khmer Rouge, despite their brutality, were China's clients. Their downfall meant a Soviet-aligned Vietnam controlled both sides of China's southern frontier. Diplomatic warnings and protests failed to slow the Vietnamese advance. In late January 1979, Deng Xiaoping traveled to Washington and told President Carter, "The child is getting naughty. It's time he got spanked." The message was blunt. Beijing would not tolerate a Soviet-backed power dominating Indochina and threatening China's borders. The calculus in Beijing shifted from negotiation to force. The decision was made. China would launch a short, sharp, punitive expedition to teach Vietnam a lesson and reassert its regional influence, no matter the cost. The alliance that had once shaped the fate of Southeast Asia was now shattered. What began as brotherhood had become a contest of will and pride. The stage was set for a war that would test not only armies, but the very doctrines and leadership that defined them. At dawn on February 17, 1979, the silence along the border shattered under the weight of hundreds of artillery pieces. Thousands of shells crashed down on Vietnamese positions in the darkness, clearing the way for the largest Chinese military operation since Korea. As the barrage lifted, more than 200,000 Chinese troops surged across a front stretching from Lao Cai in the west to Lang Son in the east. The plan relied on overwhelming numbers, 3 to 6 attackers for every defender. On paper, victory looked certain. But beneath the surface, the People's Liberation Army was carrying the scars of a 26-year peace. The last time Chinese units had seen combat was in 1953, at the close of the Korean War. Decades of political upheaval had hollowed out the officer corps. The Cultural Revolution had stripped the army of its best teachers and replaced doctrine with dogma. Most new conscripts had fired live ammunition only once or twice before the invasion. In every company, only 3 men were taught to read a map. Orders moved by hand signals and shouted commands, not radios. The armored spearhead was no better prepared. Chinese tank crews rolled forward in Type 59s, Type 62s, and Type 63s, designs dating back to the 1950s. Their armor, just 35 to 50 millimeters thick, offered little protection against the Soviet-made Saga anti-tank missiles waiting on the hillsides. Vietnamese troops, hardened by 30 years of war, had stockpiled American and Soviet weapons in bunkers and tunnels, ready for the onslaught. The force was obsolete in both training and equipment. As the first waves pressed into the border towns and ridgelines, the gap between theory and reality became impossible to ignore. Human wave assaults, unchanged since the Korean War, met disciplined fire from dug-in defenders. Tanks bogged down or burned under missile fire. Coordination broke down as units lost their way in the jungle, unable to read their own maps. By the end of the first day, the People's Liberation Army's numerical advantage was already bleeding away. The war had barely begun, but the cost of outdated doctrine and rushed training was measured in bodies. The illusion of swift victory dissolved in the mud and smoke along the border. The hills around Dongdang became a proving ground for everything that had gone wrong in China's war plan. The 55th Army's 163rd Division advanced on Hill 386, facing Vietnamese defenders dug into old French fortifications and hidden bunkers. By the time the hill was taken, 118 Vietnamese had been killed, but the cost for the Chinese was far higher than expected. At Tam Mo, the armored spearhead was shattered. Nearly half of the supporting tanks were knocked out by Soviet Saga missiles and RPGs, their hulls left smoking in the mud. The infantry, trained for human wave attacks, pressed forward in tight formation and were cut down by machine gun fire from unseen positions. The Vietnamese 63rd Company, numbering no more than 50 men, staged a textbook ambush on a Chinese battalion. Outnumbered by as much as 20 to 1, they waited until the enemy was fully committed, then opened fire from 3 sides. The Chinese unit broke and scattered, leaving bodies and equipment strewn across the hillside. In this sector, massed assaults gave way to chaos, and the People's Liberation Army was forced to abandon human wave tactics in favor of smaller, more cautious advances. Inside the French fort, the fighting reached a level of brutality rarely seen in modern war. Vietnamese accounts claim that after refusing to surrender, hundreds of soldiers and civilians were killed when Chinese troops used gasoline, explosives, and flamethrowers to clear the underground bunkers. The true number is impossible to verify, but the destruction was total. By the end of the week, the 55th Army had suffered 1,200 dead and 3,700 wounded, nearly 5,000 casualties in a single small sector. The ground gained was measured in meters, the losses in generations. Lang Son, just 130 kilometers from Hanoi, became the crucible of the campaign. On February 27th, Chinese forces seized the northern heights after a combined assault of tanks and infantry. The attack cracked open the city's defenses, but the real battle began in the streets. Over the next 3 days, block by block, house by house, the city was reduced to rubble. The Vietnamese 3rd Gold Star Division, veterans of decades of war, fought to the last man. By March 6th, the southern heights fell, but the cost was staggering. Chinese units reported thousands of casualties in less than a week. Behind the front lines, the limits of China's war machine were exposed. 1 in 3 tons of ammunition, food, and water had to be carried by hand or animal. Porters, many of them peasants pressed into service, struggled over shattered roads and muddy trails, often under fire. Supplies fell short, units went hungry, and wounded men waited hours for evacuation. Officers, many promoted for party loyalty rather than competence, argued over orders while the enemy closed in. The logistics network, stretched to the breaking point, slowed every advance. Lang Son did not fall for lack of courage on either side. It fell because the attackers could still outnumber the defenders, even as their own support system buckled. The city's ruins stood as proof. Overwhelming numbers alone could not deliver victory without organization, training, or reliable supply. The campaign had reached its operational limit, and every gain was paid for in blood. Today, China's military is among the world's most advanced, rebuilt on lessons written in blood. When states gamble on outdated doctrines, the price is always paid in lives, not just numbers. The cost of military failure never truly fades. What risks do modern armies repeat, unseen until too late?